Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Thank you very much. So I'm a new lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, so before I actually start talking about this topic, I thought I'd briefly mention some of the other stuff I'm doing, mostly because I'm trying to advertise my general existence and potentially find collaborators, we'll see. One of the projects that I'm finishing up with the Indiana University at the moment is on viewer privacy. So this is a screenshot from LinkedIn. LinkedIn allows reciprocal information between people who view profiles and people who own profiles. So if you've ever been on LinkedIn, it sends you 1,000,001 emails. Some of those emails include information like who's viewed your profile. So whenever we see reciprocal information of that type, typically it causes some level of chilling effect. So people are less willing to interact with the profile if they know the interaction will be disclosed. So one of the research projects I have is looking at that. I had a graduate student at Indiana University that was from Saudi Arabia and was very interested in the use of WhatsApp, particularly the privacy settings in Saudi Arabia. This is really interesting in terms of concerns, expectations, and how people maintain social groups, particularly since WhatsApp seems to have this opinion that if you've gotten on WhatsApp, you must be a friend with every other person on WhatsApp, and happily goes and uploads your entire contact list and automatically friends you with everyone, which is fine back when it was just your friends. But if you're a woman inside of Saudi Arabia, you cannot actually move between 2 points without effectively a cab, which means that frequently you have people in your phone book that are in fact cab drivers. It's a very common situation. And so you end up actually sharing your phone number, which is the unique identifier on WhatsApp, with a large number of people. And so we did a survey looking at the concerns and expectations and how people were managing these sorts of issues on WhatsApp. And so some interesting stuff there. I just started at Edinburgh, but we're looking at some things. So one of them is security of health apps. Health apps are horrifically designed for security. Most of it's because security is hard to do. Quite frankly, it's really hard to get right, and it's really hard to get right for everyone. From an end user all the way down to a system administrator, to a developer, it's just hard across the board. And so what can we do as far as HCI to try and make some of the building of apps easier? Make them make more sense for people who maybe don't have a 4-year degree. We're in the age where apparently everyone can code, according to social media. And that's terrifying for security. How do we make it a little bit less terrifying? And similarly, there's this question of how do you do system administration? System administrators are users too. We seem to feel that we can throw harder problems at them, but they're also still human. And so what can we do to support their understanding of networks and support their management of security? All right, but back to the primary topic of this talk, which is the human factors of software updates. So I did this research before this comment came out, just to make a point there. But this is from XKCD. Urgent critical update available. Details. Fixes an issue that was causing random laptop electrical fires. This update will require restarting your computer. Remind me later. This is classic, and most people identify with it pretty well. I like to think of software updates as unsolved solved problems. So we sometimes get a problem. For example, the heartbleed incident from, actually I'm not sure how long ago it is now, but like just over a year. We had 600,000 vulnerable servers to heartbleed. Good news though, it's not a massive hole that we found. It's actually very patchable. So what's the first thing we do? We find a patchable hole. Well, we patch it and we release the update. 1 month later, we had 300,000 vulnerable servers. It's awesome, we got rid of half the vulnerable servers. 2 months later, still 300,000 vulnerable servers. And by 1 year later, it's now 200,000. This is a solved problem. This is not a mystery. It's not even hard to fix. And yet we're still looking at a third of the servers online who have not patched it.
Can you quickly remind me, does Heartbeat affect Windows or is it a Linux vulnerability?
I actually don't know. I think it's Linux. It affects servers is the key thing. I don't. It's SSL.
OpenSSL, okay. So basically, this isn't characteristic of Windows Update. This is characteristic
No.
of Linux.
And I'm going to actually bounce across Windows Update versus other types of updates. This one, for instance, targets mostly Windows. This is a study of 10,000 Windows users done somewhere around 2012, looking across 13 countries. That's a fun number. So what you're looking at here is not everybody really installs updates. And it's really interesting to see this graph in light of the research I'll talk to you later. Because first off, that's an enormous number of people who aren't updating. But if you look at the delta between that and the 3 updates later, people are installing the updates. Not everybody, clearly, but there is a delay and a huge number. And what's also really interesting if you look at this table is the list of different applications. Yep.
I think a few more things are lurking in these numbers, and that, for instance, Java, right? So a bunch of these things got uninstalled as a result of the harassment that you get through the update process, right? Mm-hmm. Also, the U.S. government saying nasty things about Java.com. So it's out of the ones that still had it running, how many of them were still unpatched? I presume that's 72%.
So in the Blue Hat lecture he did, the author for this described this as, we called people up on the phone and said, will you please install this exe that collects all this data? This is being one type of data that was collected. This is pre-2012. I think Microsoft collects some of this data more internally now. And they just looked at the exe files. One of the observations that was made at this year's Security and Privacy is that a lot of systems have multiple versions of the same piece of software installed by multiple other pieces of software. So things like Adobe Reader sometimes has like 4 versions. And so if you try to update Adobe Reader, if you're the best user out there and you're updating right away, you still might not have updated all the Adobe Readers. And that also, I think, ties a little bit into this.
That is true. But I think the question is also what matters. I mean, there's vulnerable and then there's exploited. And so you look at Gen Pop, right? You look at general population. Let's assume that these are accurate statistics. Then you look at the botnet. What's the case? What's the case there?
I think you're almost sitting at a level below where I'm at, because I do agree that there's a difference between exploitable and not. But we see a lot of things. So Tudor Dimitris has some work in this, looking at the multiple different versions and how to actually cause exploits to variant versions. So just because it's not currently being exploited doesn't necessarily mean it can't be. And he has, no, okay.
Well, we can take some of this discussion. I mean, the impact of exploits varies widely, and the attractiveness of these things varies widely. So just, they're not comparable one-to-one in some sense. Vulnerable this is not the same as vulnerable that, as a result of these impacts being different.
Yeah. Well, at the more high level, we're okay. So this was just me trying to demonstrate that these are some of the top pieces of software that are actually being attacked. Malicious software writers are very aware that there's a lot of people who aren't updating Java, and they're very aware that Java is buggy. And we see it for other things. I mean, Windows is a very common piece of software, which also causes it to be a common source of attack. This is probably not necessary for this crowd, but I do this talk in front of a lot of people with a wide variety. So we're going to do the really high level on what the heck is an update and why do you need one. I get the feeling you kind of know this, but at the very high level, an update is just something that changes a piece of software. You used to have piece of software A, you now have piece of software B. This is an example of this happening very visually on iTunes. What this means for security is if you have a computer and the computer has a bunch of files installed or different programs installed on it, some of those programs can have holes or bugs or problems. If you feed in a malicious if you use that program, which may not even be internet facing, to open another file, that file can be used to trick the system into doing something malicious using the holes. An update, at least the security ones, are designed to patch the holes and prevent this problem. The one time I tried to do this lecture in front of a media arts people, I realized that I desperately needed that slide. But we are more concerned with this question, which is, why aren't people updating software? I'm going to talk about 2 studies that were done. This is an interview study, which is the one I'm going to start with, and then I later did a follow-up survey of a much larger number of people. In this study, what we did was we brought in a bunch of students from Michigan State University. We ran custom PowerShell script on their machines to pull down the logs. We had them do a short survey in the middle of the lab, and then we did about a 40-minute interview with them. The participants were 27 of them. They were aged 21 to 57. We actually had a good female-to-male split. Note that they are all graduate students. We tried to keep the technical ones out, but that is bias. But don't mistake that for them being security conscious. Out of the 15 had at least one security problem of some varying type. So 6 had either not installed or disabled their antivirus. 2 had turned their firewalls off. 7 of them had either turned off or limited user account control. And 6 of them had either turned off or limited Windows Update. Just to make sure we all understand how Windows Update works. It actually happens in about 3 phases. Most of this talk is going to focus on Windows 7 because that's what the most common version of Windows that happened at the time of this study. So this graph is about Windows 7. Windows 8 and 10 work similarly, but not quite the same. So what happens here is, starting with this blue box, Windows just goes and automatically checks for updates. It pulls the updates down and notifies the end user. Users get upset when you reboot their computer. So it tries to give the user a time period during which they can decide whether or not they want to update the software, which is what this green dotted box is. This is optional. The user, once they're shown a notification, gets to just think about it for about 24 hours until 3 a.m. for Windows 7 anyway, at which point the system decides that this stuff really needs to get installed, automatically installs it, and then, if necessary, reboots the computer. This progression is important because some users never hit the red box. They see the notification, they install the update, they didn't even know it's possible to have it forced. Some users never notice the notification and only see the red box, and therefore assume that it just always installs and forces them to reboot their computer. It's a common source of confusion amongst users.
Excuse me?
Mm-hmm.
It's complicated in that in the case of laptops, because it does take into account whether the machine is on power or not.
Yes. It does take that into account. Windows Update is what I've been broadly referring to as a triggered event. So it automatically updates when a set of conditions have been made. In Windows 7, the primary condition is 3 a.m. I don't know. I haven't experimented with laptops enough to answer this question. I've had enough anecdotal evidence to tell you that users are suspicious that it updates even when it's not plugged in. That said, I can't tell you whether they're accurate or not. They just tell me that it does this and kills their battery. So I haven't had that opportunity to do the experimentation. So for this study, we saw most people sitting on the standard default, which is just automatic update. 4 participants had set it to notify them about an update, but not automatically install it, and 2 had disabled it entirely. I'm going to start talking briefly about the log file analysis, but I won't go into too much depth on it. But we're really interested in 2 questions. So are users installing updates, and are users installing updates quickly? So this is just a graph of the number of months the user has owned the computer against the number of updates that have been installed. This is a very rough metric. The green dots are everybody who has automatic updates installed or set up, so they're automatically installing. The yellow dots are all users that have set to notify, and the people who turned it off have no updates installed, so they're just not on this graph. Admittedly, this is a little bit eyeballing, but we're not seeing a large difference between people who are notifying and people who are just automatically seeing it, which switches us to the question of, okay, if they are installing it, what does the time to patch look like?
Do you have anybody who proactively searches for updates?
Yes.
And you counted them as which?
Not in this study.
Okay.
All right. We do see a much wider time to patch. The top of that box is sitting at about 20 days. And I mean, the automatic people, both there are less of them, and so that naturally tries to bring the box down. but we're seeing them do it faster. And what's also interesting is if you break them out. So what you're looking at here is these are all individual participants. This is days to update. 30 days is the middle line, if you can't read it. They're sorted by their median update time. Some of the people over on the far right, like this bar, never uses his laptop, and so you're seeing a wide time to patch. It's also interesting that you're seeing for the people who do notify, they're almost always skewed upward. This is actually falling very much in line with what you would expect. They're being notified about an update. Sometimes they install it right away. Sometimes they delay it for a while because they have more opportunity to delay than the people who have the automatic installations. So the short version we're getting out of this graph is people are installing the updates. If given the option, they are delaying the updates, but they do actually get around to installing. And if we switch over to looking at this a little bit more from the survey perspective, so what people gave us as far as structured answers, don't worry about that. So we asked them, what do you think Windows Update's doing on your machine, on your individual computer? So do you think it's going to notify you before it installs stuff? Do you think it's going to notify you after it has installed the updates? Do you think it does both of these two things? The correct answer is it does do both, depending on the settings. So the people in the green boxes are correct. There's some kind of good and bad news here. The good news is that the people who had changed their settings to notify knew they had done it. So they were fully aware that they were in charge of installing these things. It was not going to automatically install, and they did know that. Oddly, a lot of people think that it's notifying them before it installs the update, and that it's actually automatically installing the update. So if we kind of go back to this diagram, remember I said that some people never encounter one box or the other because they either miss it or they don't see it. A lot of people feel that we need to reboot right now to finish installing your updates dialog that they had on Windows 7. Was it asking to update right then? And that leads to the situation where we see 20 users who feel that it is in fact their responsibility to decide when the updates will be installed. So, okay, again, this is not really news, right? Users don't necessarily identify this. What's interesting is we see it happen across more than just Microsoft Windows. So this is Java. We were collecting the version information from several different applications. Java came up very frequently in the interviews as this thing that was really confusing they didn't understand. In the survey, we asked them, does it auto-check for updates? Does it auto-install the update? Is it not automatic at all? And do you just not have it installed? And we compared that to what was actually going on their computer. About the same story here. What's interesting is that the biggest number here, 14, feel that it is their job to update. They know the system is not going to automatically update. They are fully aware that updating can only happen when they hit the button. And yet, they're not updating. And so there's a lot of potential reasoning behind why they're not updating, but what this graph and the prior one basically says is that users are aware that they are the gatekeepers to making this decision, and yet they're deciding not to make it. And so why? What's actually causing that? So we did interviews here. I'm going to talk through them really fast because I did a slightly more in-depth study, which I'm going to talk to next. The high-level outcomes of this work is that people really didn't like their user interface changing very quickly. This is primarily mentioned in terms of iTunes, which had decided to change the user interface right before our study. And they'd hear from their friends that this change was going to happen, and they'd go find how to disable the automatic updates because they didn't want their music to vanish, which is the way they would describe it. They didn't know what some software was. So I have a lot of great quotes about Java. What is a Java? Why do I need a Java? I deleted the Java and then something else broke. And software that's functioning right now. So there's an American term that's, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so a lot of users had this opinion that if they went out to go fix this thing that was working right now, it was just going to get worse. I mean, it was good now. They didn't need better. And if they went fix it, it was going to get worse. So this was Adobe Reader all over. I have a quote from Richard Smith. It's basically, it's reading PDF files. Why does it need to update? Why indeed? So the outcome of that led to this question of what factors do users consider when deciding to update or not? And so in order to ask this, we turned to a survey because we wanted a wider set than 37 graduate students to get a better sense. So we used Mechanical Turk with this. The standard limitations that apply, namely that these are slightly more technically savvy users when it comes to interacting with the internet. We asked them if they felt that they ask other people for help, and if they feel that other people ask them for help as a measurement of skill. I can tell you they all think that other people ask them for help, and they never ask anyone, according to them, with some minor exceptions. So we got 307 responses. So the way this survey worked is first we asked them some demographics questions, and then we just asked them to tell us a story about a software update event. We tried to be very general, but we made it very clear that they could tell us a good story, a bad story, just tell us about something that happened to you involving a software update. We then asked them 17 follow-up questions about that experience, including whether they consider it to be a positive or negative experience, how they became aware of the update, why they did or did not install this particular piece of software, what made them decision. And then after that, we asked them to tell us the opposite of what they told us before. So if they told us a positive story before, we asked them if they could please tell us a negative story. We correctly predicted that most of them would tell us negative stories beforehand. About 2/3 decided to select a negative story. And we wanted to also understand what makes an update a positive experience, not just a negative one. So I'm going to focus on some of the high-level results of that. This is actually still being written up in a paper that hopefully will get submitted soon. There's a lot of interesting things here that aren't going to be necessarily presented. One of the key ones is the dropout during the process of updating. So we think of updating frequently as just that one dialogue, but as I'll kind of talk about as I go through these, updating is in fact an enormous process, starting from becoming aware of the update, having to do various preparations in advance of the update, getting locked down in a specific location while it does the update, and then dealing with some of the after effects of it. And you'll kind of see that in some of the discussion here. The 4 things that I think are really interesting coming out of this, though, is first off that reputation really matters. People are really concerned about whether or not it's worth the bother of updating. Resource consumption was a major concern. And then one of the interesting, if somewhat minor findings, is this whole conflation between updates and viruses. So we'll go through those. People research updates. A shocking number of people research updates. This is by no means a large percentage of my data set. We're looking at closer to like 10 or 15%, but they are still talking a lot about updating and asking their friends, asking the internet, looking up reviews, looking up these kind of reviews, generally trying to figure out what does this thing do? What's it gonna do? Reading stuff like from this guy, reading my text, you can keep the bugs. So people are really concerned about these sorts of things. And what they were mostly looking for when they were looking at recommendations are changes to features.
Well, wait a second. So what people are concerned about these, right? I mean, people who self-select to publish these reviews are concerned about this, but in a general setting, what percentage of people are indeed concerned about these kinds of issues, especially the non-technical ones, which, as you mentioned, MTurk. Well, it gets you some, right? But it's kind of a mixed bag.
It is definitely a mixed bag. The other key thing to note here is we're not actually looking at percentage of update events. We're looking at things that are most salient to end users. So when I ask you a first story, what is the story you think of first? It's a decent representation of that. It's a horrible representation of what the actual percentage of events are in your life, because you're responding based on what you most remember. That said, if I were to ask you for a story if I was your friend, it's also the story you're most likely to relate. And if you were to think back on the last event when trying to decide what you're doing next, it's something you might think of or remember. So it's kind of a positioning of this work in that regards. I can't tell you what percentage of people in what percentage of time actually do reviewing. I can tell you from the tone of the stories that we...
You can, because you know how many views and how many users there are. So you know the percentage.
I know the percentage of people who responded about it. I even had a cheat sheet. Okay, I can't find it. Ask me later, and I will give you the actual percentage, because we asked people in the follow-up survey for the first story whether or not they had researched. We didn't even just wait for them to respond here. When they're talking about things, they don't always discuss it. More frequently, they say, oh, I heard, or oh, I saw, or I went to go check this out, or I glanced through these sorts of reviews. When I say research, I mean it very broadly. I include, like, my friend installed this and told me it was awful. But that's kind of where it's a little mix of reputation and things. And there are some things that people were really willing to spend the time. So particularly jailbroken devices. They weren't updating until the jailbreak was going to work on the other side of the update. And they were very clear about this. So key features that they really cared about. If there's a particular feature they really cared about, they would go research before the update. There were a lot of people that just updated to see just because you're supposed to. But for those that did research, these are the things they were concerned about. Was it more buggy? Is it going to eat more of my battery? I decided that I wasn't going to install the update because I've heard all the reviews online about how it generally makes your phone slower in every respect. So this is a common sort of statement that I would get in stories. Is it worth the bother? So here's Dogbert, the product designer. I created an operating system that uses 80% of your time begging for updates. That still leaves a healthy 20% of your time to reboot your computer over and over. Of course, his boss asks if it also faxes. But this was a common statement. So we hear a lot about, I hate reboots, I hate all these other sorts of things. But the key undertone that you heard a lot is this going to be worth the amount of effort I'm about to put into it? And it does actually require a fair amount of effort in some case. When considering this, they worry about things like how important is this software. So people understand that their antivirus is important, and they'll say that. They don't think iTunes is important because they don't use it very often. It might be a common comment. Effort required to do the installation, the risk of the installation, the amount of disruption, which is where most of the reboot sits, but sometimes it disrupts in other sorts of ways. So this user hit most of them. I generally do not update iTunes because I think there are too many of them, and I don't regularly use the software. So I'm also annoyed by the fact there's another program update added to the prompt. So I have to uncheck it since it downloads junk software onto my computer otherwise.
Also, Java does this, right? It might be related to why the Java update is also less frequently applied.
Java is fascinating because Java just switched. Java used to install the AST toolbar, which Microsoft now considers some versions of which to be a virus and removes it, and has just switched to now altering your default search engine to Yahoo. And I will get back to that in a moment because it is such an exciting topic. Resources. Resources were a serious concern, particularly in terms of delaying. So if we want to talk about why users delay, and someone mentioned it earlier, that even Windows itself respects the battery life and will attempt to delay an update until that resource is available. So we see things like, okay, there's a download coming, so I better back up stuff before I even try this. Because it eats all my drive space, particularly if I'm on a budget device like an iPhone, particularly budget end of an iPhone. And this is also an issue with data plan limits. So it actually costs a lot of money for me to get this update down onto my device. It gets even more fun when my device isn't mobile. So I have some users talk about how they have to visit the library or some other public place in order to get the Wi-Fi necessary to pull down the updates on their mobile devices. And then I have a couple stories about devices such as Xboxes and PS2s that aren't connected to the internet because they don't have internet at home. And so these whole epic stories about how this person went to the friend's house, downloaded an update onto a USB drive, went back to their house, plugged it in, it didn't work for some reason, and then somewhere in the middle of this whole process gave up. Decided it just wasn't that important of an update. And so for non-mobile devices, or devices that can't be moved onto one of these locations, we see long delays of these sorts of things. So I first had to delete half the apps on my phone, and I also uploaded my pictures to my computer and delete them off of my phone because I didn't have enough usage to install the update. iPhone user. Common problem. Resources are also a major issue while installing the update. This is where we hit battery power, processing power, locked out of using devices. So it costs processing power. Some of these devices are overly loaded at any given moment. So if I install an update in the background, you assume that, oh, they must have that much background processor free. I have several users that basically explained how their system just mysteriously came to a crawl and they couldn't figure out what to do about the situation until they finally figured out that Windows Update was doing this. And so they went into the update settings and changed them to notify because it was not worth the delay to their job that this was causing, because even though it was a background update, their system was too laden to handle a background update. Windows Update drains my processing resources, preventing backups and even stopping me from running stat software for my job. So this type of thing happened, and not just for Windows. Okay, so now we're going to get back to your comment a little bit. Updates contain viruses. This is not a large percentage of my story data set, but it's such an interesting percentage, we'll talk about it. We're also talking about it because when I present this to undergrads, not this research specifically, but how to be safe online, I get this question from some random member of the audience. Oh, but I heard updates involve viruses. And this happens to me often enough that this slide is now up here. I honestly could not tell if it was trustworthy. I did not know if I should accept it or not. I chose not, and it was a wise choice, as a friend told me later that it was a virus. I have no idea how this friend would know this. I'm betting you that the person described something that looked like it came off the internet, and the friend just decided that things off the internet are bad. Became very hesitant and did not install a Windows Update due to a virus that exploited Windows Update and allowed it improper code to be signed to Microsoft certificates. This resulted in multiple rootkit virus that was compromised by the system. If I remember correctly, this was a particular one-off news article that went out, but this user actually absorbed that data and solved that problem by turning off Windows Update because it's dangerous and updates contain viruses. All right, so we have that problem, which is just a general problem, but it's actually being conflated a lot by the bundled software. Go ahead.
All fairness, they're not exactly looking for Yeti here in that some social engineering attacks do in fact pretend to be update like UI, to be, that they put up this update like UIs, and this is actually an excellent way to get to drop binaries in the system.
It's actually worse than that. So if you look at Android particularly, I'm a one-off developer in Android. I've made this shiny new flashlight app that's actually respecting your privacy. By the way, flashlight apps are insanely dangerous on Android. Don't install them. But I've made a new one. You really like it. I've got a whole pile of users. And so some company comes in and says, oh, I'll offer you $6,000 for this app. And you're like, oh, pay dirt. And so you hand over the credentials, you get your $6,000, and they install malware on that many devices overnight with no warning. And in that regard, yeah, we're looking at a combination of it's not clear when something is or is not a valid update. I had several of the stories feature a situation in which an update popped up, they closed it, and then they went and found the home page and installed it. We're looking at mTurk users. They're a little bit more nervous about these things. But again, we're looking at those sorts of channel attacks. And while this may be a one-off news article, it did happen. I've been told by security professionals that actually one of the fun things to attack is Wireshark. If you can break into the Wireshark update chain, oh boy, those are fun computers.
What is Wireshark?
Wireshark is a network analysis tool. It's used almost entirely by system administrator type people, the people that have the better credentials to steal. All right, so bundled software. This is interesting. So in case you don't know what bundled software is, this is the best example I could find for you. Flash would love it if you also installed the McAfee Security Plus tool. Some people describe this as a blocking problem. for them, not because it's impossible to uncheck these boxes, but because if you screw up, you end up wasting several hours of your life undoing the problem. And because of that, even though this is a low effort, it's high risk. And so if you don't see a good reason to do it, some people are like, oh, I just don't even try. Because if I did, it's just not worth it. And so they delay it or they just don't update at all. But it gets a little bit better. So the update for QuickTime gave me problems because it comes with an add-on software. Some of the software has viruses and can harm the computer. It also has redirects and takes over search engines. I decide not to update from them unless I really need it. So if you think about what a virus looks like to an average end user, what do viruses do? They put up pop-ups, they change your search engine, they change your home page. This is the sort of behavior of a virus. I had an informatics professor show up in my office right after Mozilla decided to change the default search engine to Yahoo because he was desperately concerned he had a virus on his machine. Why? Viruses do things like that. And so what you're actually seeing, particularly with Java, as it was brought up earlier, when you see things that where updates are emulating virus-type activity, it's actually causing a learning feedback loop to some degree for end users that, oops, I installed a virus. That's what a virus looks like. These things contain viruses, and you start ending up with that particular opinion. That said, thankfully, I didn't actually see that many stories that cover this, but as I said, a surprising number of undergrads are concerned about it. So it's interesting. So what can we do out of this? One interesting question is how do we support things like review behavior? So people are really interested in going out and finding information about these updates. What can we do to either support them finding of information by presenting information that's more interesting or supporting them through providing more feedback to the reviews? So if you look at reviews for updates, they're actually pretty minimal compared to, say, something like what you see on Amazon or any of these other sites that do reviewing. It would be nice if we can actually provide some accurate real-time information to users. I know we can't tell up front whether or not an update will reboot your machine because we don't know what will be in memory at the time of the installation. It'd be nice if I knew before I hit the update button if I'm going to need to reboot my machine. It'd also be nice to know how much I actually use something. There are a lot of client-side statistics that might be very assistive to an end user when they're attempting to make these decisions. This is almost an impossible problem, but how do we clarify which updates are actually updates and which of them are actually viruses or malicious? It'd be interesting to see a discussion of workflows. I see some users who talk about, oh, I really wanted to use this software right now. And then I see other users who are like, yeah, I really need to use that software right now, so I minimize the update window. And when I finished using the software, I hit the button to update. I have seen very few interfaces that actually allow options such as install this as soon as I am finished.
So that was one thing I noticed. In both the studies you describe, you don't look at the temporal characteristics of when people are updating. And I wondered, that would probably be very revealing about when would be the best time to offer up.
That's actually a good question. I'm trying to think if I did look at any of that in the data. I did ask people where they were physically located and how busy they were. But I wasn't really seeing any good correlations between that and some of the contents of the stories. The biggest problem is that when I asked for story-type data, stories usually encompass multiple updates over a long time frame to form a full and cohesive story. And so some of the questions about like where were you did really make sense to end users, which is why I haven't really dealt with that data. And a little bit of what I've been talking about, a lot of people will delay till they have a moment, but I can't quantify what that is at the moment. So that's an interesting question.
Certain things are best done in the dark, you know. So, I mean, the latest macOS thing is basically the switch there is do it tonight, or do it tomorrow kind of thing. And I think they kind of go and sense when you're not using the machine to figure out when tonight is for you. And then on the Windows side, it's a 4-hour window, which is pretty far out and oftentimes pushes you into nighttime anyhow. So, I mean, it's sort of, I think there'll be a spike after hours, is my suspicion.
I agree. I actually might have a little bit of that data for my 37 subjects, but they're also grad students, and when tonight is might be a little different. Yeah.
I'm interested in your build trust point. I'm particularly interested in whether you think users have different levels of trust they associate with the different providers.
Definitely.
They do.
I'm not even hesitating. I mean, I don't know if I have quite the right data to state that in a publication, but one of the studies I would like to run as soon as I get a grad student to run it would look.
Where are we?
Huh?
Where are we?
Where are we? You're actually not doing too bad. So if you look at it from an Airbar's perspective, Apple is sitting around here, ranging from, oh, thank God I've been wanting that new shiny thing, to Apple screws everything up, wants me to buy a new device, and I never update their stuff. Microsoft is kind of sitting in the ambivalent middle. People hate the reboots. This is not news. But broadly, they don't seem to find the updates to be that problematic. But one of the big reasons they don't is that you provide an ability to revert. So the tone here is a little bit that there's a safety net when things go wrong. So what happens, and you see this in stories, particularly ones featuring a Microsoft update failure. So what will happen is that they'll try to update, something will go horribly wrong, they'll describe how horrible it was, and then they'll explain that they just reverted the system and didn't update for the next week. Users also have a lot of faith in companies' ability to work out bugs. So they strong differentiation between what they think the company put in there on purpose and what they think the company put in there on accident. So if they think the company put that in by accident, then their reaction to something negative online is, oh, I'm going to wait a couple days. Because they have faith that developers will fix those sorts of problems. If they think that Apple purposefully turned off the support for their first generation iPod, they don't think that they're going to sort that out. And as a result, they just disable all the updates. The build trust is an interesting thing because very rarely do I see statements like updates just cause problems. Usually I see statements like Java is awful, or Microsoft picks the worst times for rebooting my computer. They're almost all prepended with a statement from a particular company or a particular software brand. They seem to have a very strong. Now, what I'm not sure is if that carries through into the app type model. I saw a little bit of that in apps, but it's not strong enough. Usually I'll see things like, oh, app updates on my iPhone are fine. They'll particularly call out the iPhone, but they won't necessarily pull out, and I don't know.
Focusing on the provider, right? Focusing on the manufacturer. I mean, like Rage and all of that is great, but does it actually affect things? So, like, can you line it up with the stock price or something? I mean, in the case of Adobe, more seriously though, in the last year alone, we've seen so many CVEs released that, I mean, the poor company, frankly, is in the gutter. Java is not a boon for Oracle at this point at all. I mean, I think we are probably doing okay on that front, at least now. In like 99, 2000, that was a different story. But my sense is that those sort of smaller, if you will, like in the case of Adobe especially, companies do bear the grunt of a lot of this negativity to a point where it's like a measurable effect.
So there's a very interesting presentation by the person at Adobe in charge of update at whatever the update workshop is, and I'm spacing on the name of it. It hasn't run for a couple of years, in which he tried to explain why it was Adobe wasn't automatically updating. Because you'd think that this would solve the problem if we just automatically updated. And it's a really interesting talk that he gives because one of his primary reasons is actually legal. In a lot of countries, it's illegal to just reach into someone's computer, change the code without telling them. They call that hacking. And so there was a deep concern initially before Microsoft started really testing these waters about the safety for a company about going and pushing these automatic updates out. And so if you look at who started doing the automatic updating first, it had less to do with like, you know, who was innovative about this concept and more to do with who had enough lawyers to back up the problem. And so you look at it, right? Microsoft did this first, and they did it much like they kind of put their toe in to some degree, or until all the way now we hit Windows 10 where you can't turn it off if you're a home user. And I'm fascinated to see how that turns out. To like Google try it next. And then we didn't even see Java doing this till like 2 or 3 years ago. You'd think Java is the most invisible thing to a user. It's the smartest thing to automatic update in many cases, unless you're on a corporate network or a couple things. But most of those people know to turn off the updates for their devices. But they weren't willing to do it, and Adobe wasn't willing to do it because they were concerned about the legal implications. So now we're seeing Adobe, which admittedly has an enormous number of problems, starting to push the automatic route. For a long time, Adobe actually had this policy, if you read their documentation, where they would automatically download the update and then wait 30 days before it would automatically install it. So if you didn't get around to installing it for 30 days, it would auto-install, because they were trying to provide the most amount of notification to an end user. So it's kind of a roundabout answer to your question.
So some of the Adobe stuff also had the horrible property that it took the Windows boot sequence in order to pre-cache some stuff. And the consequence of this was that if you installed an Adobe update, it was essential that you had to reboot immediately your Windows computer. And so this 30-day delay thing, a lot of what they were doing basically was hoping that you would reboot your computer for some other reason within those 30 days, at which point they would grab it.
I didn't know that. That's actually very interesting. Thank you. I didn't know that one. The other part of his talk that I thought was just kind of hilarious is apparently I had some security hole, they patched it, they pushed it out. He described it as waiting for the other shoe to drop for someone to finally start exploiting this. And then he got a phone call from one of their data centers who was, according to them, almost experiencing a DDoS level attack on this particular update patch. And it turned out that someone had used it to steal World of Warcraft players' accounts. And so people were actually driving home from work to patch this piece of software. Because it was like the patch was out on all the forums, like, you better do this right now. It took him a while to figure it out, but he'd never had a DDoS level attack on his on the update channel before. So it's kind of interesting. Okay, anyway, so one of the outcomes, it's not quite there, that I'd like to take this work is how do we communicate what's actually happening in an update to an end users? And I like to think of this as kind of like the 5 questions. So if we were to answer 5 questions on every update interface, what should they be? What information is most important to an end user to know? And if we were to do something like a review website, like I see review websites for clothing that ask things like, was this the size it claimed to be? Was this the color it claimed to be? Or if you go on to a travel website, was the hotel clean? Like, what are those standard questions? And so one of the things I'm trying to pull out is what those questions should be. And this is an initial attempt at that. But from the resource downloads, like, how big is this upload, as this download file? Like, how much resources will it take to install? How long will this update take to install on my computer? I realize that's a very challenging question to answer. But one of the worst things I saw from people was we tried to code for how long the updates were taking, which totally failed, because some people think 10 minutes is way too long, and some people think 30 minutes is just fine. But the thing that made it most negative was when it was outside of their expectations. So I don't mean an accurate prediction, I mean a ballpark. How long am I going to be tied down to this one spot that has wireless? Is it going to be an hour? Is it going to be 2 hours? Is it going to be 10 minutes? Will a reboot be needed? Like, how much, basically, how much of a bother is this going to be to me? Well, is this a silent update? So a lot of the security updates are effectively silent, right? They don't change anything. Is this going to change anything I see? And how will this update impact performance? And that last question is the one that they are least likely to believe from the developer, but might be really interesting to see on a review site, on how people are viewing the performance changes up or down. Yeah, so going forward,
to install. I mean, I thought. I mean, we know so much about the computer. I mean, we've got so many logs, and Microsoft or the vendor. I mean, if they could gather that kind of stats, you'd think you could have a predictive model of that. I mean,
one of the things that would be really fascinating to take as the next step here is to just go and create a variation of the Wix installer, where you just create. I don't know if the Wix installer would be enough, but try to take one of the common pieces of installation code, Wix being an example of that, and try to build in the answers to some of these sorts of questions. So this might be a little bit too much for Wix to figure out, but you're right. I mean, like, I don't know why we don't look at how to do this, and maybe someone does, and I just haven't made the connection yet. But these are the serious concerns that, honestly, I can't ask a developer. I can't say, you know, Can you tell me how long this will take on this arbitrary person's computer? We don't necessarily know. Some of the computers are horribly laden.
Another thing users might want to know is if it's reversible.
Yeah, actually that's a good one. I've heard that one a lot. By the way, the revert capability on Windows is heavily used not just for Windows updates.
Yeah, because these are all questions that people would also ask prior to choosing to update. But also there must be things that we can deliver to the user post updating, like the ability to revert, or other kinds of feedback about what's just happened, maybe highlighting things that are now different, or giving the user more sort of richer information at that point.
So there was a /update thread, which take that with its own grain of salt. Basically complaining, you know, I had this app yesterday, it's not working today, what do I do about this kind of /dot thing, and this long complaint thread, which I actually read through, which I try to not normally do with /dot. But it was really interesting because reverting was one of the top things on the complaints. I had this app yesterday, why can't I just go back to the way it was working yesterday? And there's, in some cases that's possible, but we're starting to see a lot more situations with servers, right? So my app doesn't work in isolation. It works in relation to this API. And so both of those things need to be functioning, and one of them will just stop supporting the situation after a while. And so it is interesting to ask whether or not reverting is possible through the app, and maybe even a way to inform a user what the time of life is of their current one. So I meet a lot of professors actually that have disabled updates for the length of the semester and then tell me that their computer just does all of that about 2 weeks after the grades are due. Because they can't afford everything going wrong during the semester, they're way too busy. And so there's this little bit of gap of like people, okay, I just need to put it off for a while. Well, how long can you actually put this off before you start seeing maybe non-security level problems with the app or the API? By the way, this is pretty much all my talk. The next slide after the next one is the questions one. So if we have questions, that's fine. Actually, I think I've gone through everything with that. So we're at the questions, but I'm going to go back to the slide because we seem to be more interested in it. So any other questions?
I mean, it seems like asking users about some of these features, if you will, while it's valuable, it has almost no way to get at the heart of the matter, so to speak, which is the benefit of the update, which is largely invisible. It's like asking a patient, well, do you like this doctor? They'll say, oh, they have a wonderful bedside manner and their offices are clean and they gave me a lollipop, which is great, but it doesn't tell you anything about the actual quality of service whether they spotted the problem or saved their life, right? So can we get at the deeper level here by asking users questions, or is that out of the...
Well, you have to remember that users are on both ends of this update. One user is the one consuming the update, but one of them is generating it. So if you think of it as software developers, I think of them as users sometimes, but they're a different style of user. So the result of this research kind of goes in both of those directions. So on one hand, how do we phrase this to an end user such that they're more likely to want it? But on the other hand, what is it the end users are worrying about can be translated backwards. I'll give you an example actually from iTunes. So the first study I did, it takes a long time to interview people. So the length of this interview process is about a month and a half. iTunes helpfully released an update with a massive user interface change on right before our initial interviews. And then a month and a half later, we finished our interviews. So it turns out what they'd done is they'd released a patch that was 160 some security vulnerabilities. And they had done it about 2 weeks before they released the major UI patch. So when I interviewed people, all of them had installed the security updates. No problems at all. The UI updates for the first batch of users, they were terrified of. One user described it as, oh my God, where'd my music go? I went back, I blocked everything. I told all my friends to block everything. A month and a half later, the sentences I was hearing were a little different. They were closer to, I saw my friend using this. I now feel like I know how to interact with it. iTunes had gone and switched between a sidebar interface to a modal interface, which is a major UI change. And so some users didn't even know how to access their music right off. So watching their friends interact with it kind of made them feel more comfortable about it. And then by the end of the interviews, I was like, well, you know, it didn't look too bad. I installed it. I've reactivated it. I bought a new iPhone. It requires me to have the latest one, so I've installed it. When you're looking at large changes that aren't bug-based, the more like user interface feature changes, there's kind of an adjustment time period. So one of the ways you can adapt this towards security is doing what they did there, which is release all the security updates with a small time lag. Users get those installed. They have the gut reaction to the UI change. They kind of get over it, as many of them as are going to, and then you start releasing the security updates again. So that's one way you can take this type of research and apply it more in the software engineering direction. Thinking more about how you are bundling the updates and what goes into each update. So if we can take the things we really want people to install and bundle them in a separate update from the things that people really worry about, it's fine. It's also a point of advertisement. So when you look at some of these interfaces for updates, you kind of see a bad example of this, but they kind of are getting some of these messages. They say the words improve performance. They say, like, when you're looking at what your app actually does, there's certain things you can pull out and say, okay, what is it the users really care about here? Well, if I put out a performance app that also happens to have the security thing in it, users are more likely to pay attention to that. That's worth the bother. So there's a little bit of marketing there. There's some really almost no research in how to explain that this is a security update and get users to care about it because it's invisible. The only example I have is somebody who decided to create an application on Windows that puts graffiti on the screen slowly as the apps on the device gets older. But, well, fun, I don't think that's necessarily going to work for most users. So I don't actually have a good answer for this. I'm kind of working on it as part of the answer. And the other part is this sentence I hear from users, which is, I installed this thing, nothing changed. Was it really worth the risk? So we need some way to communicate that something changed, or we need to communicate what other risk you just countered. Like, I would love to see a study in which we just took the most recent news article from someplace and said, this is what it's countering. If you want to be safe from this problem, this thing that just showed up in the New York Times, that's what this update does. And I don't know what that would do, but it would be an interesting study.
Is it always necessary for the user? If it's a security update, does he even need to know that there was something? But for him, nothing changed. He's just staying secure in a way, hopefully.
Microsoft is somewhat unique in that you allow multiple update channels. It's possible to install security updates without installing other updates. That's rare. Most updates are cumulative. So the moment they block the UI update, they've blocked everything. It's not just the security update. People also tend to be a bit more ambivalent. So this is where we come back to trust. So if you are actually doing what you say, then users have no problems with. Even the iTunes, where they have strong opinions about iTunes, they will happily install the security updates without the slightest bit of concern, because Apple's managed to convince them that the security updates don't screw things up, or when they do, they immediately fix it. Again, we forgive bugs to some degree. So if you can convince a user that your security updates will actually not mess anything up, and you build that trust relationship, then yeah, you should just push them silently, and it totally works. There's usually something I say here about disabled users. So I've interviewed one blind user that was explaining to me how every update on her and his whole machine is turned off because she loses the ability to even fix the machine if it updates and it messes up her screen reader. So she needs to select very specific times, either when her screen reader software approves the update or when she's in the presence of someone who can assist her with the fixing of the machine if something goes wrong, because it's a very serious problem for her. So it's kind of this mashup between, yeah, automatic updates. If we can do them safely and quietly and silently, go ahead. We should get them away from the end users. But we do need a little bit of catch in there for some of these other groups that do need it. But it's not the main group. All right, any other questions?
If not, let's thank Tammy.